Doo-doo-dee. It's Nandi!
Hello friends. With the announcement of the Black Legion rework, I thought I would revisit a popular video I did roughly a year ago. You might remember the Feeble Five, a video that highlighted the 5 worst characters in the game. Characters that you should have avoided investing in as much as possible. Abaddon was number 1 on that list, and a lot of the Black Legion characters were not far off it. Now that the Black Legion are being looked at and reworked, I thought we would revisit the list and see who needs the most help. The difference now is that we're up to almost 100 characters in the game, and I thought that 5 characters would be too few to discuss. So I expanded that to 7 and 10 before settling on 12, the Dismal Dozen, the perfect foil to my Dirty Dozen. As I've said before, this isn't a dig at Snowprint. They are putting a lot of effort into new characters and content, and as they raise the bar, some of the older characters simply fall further behind. All I want to do with this video is help point them in the direction of characters that need help. I know that Snowprint watches these videos and reads the comments, so be sure to chime in with your thoughts. Tier lists are always subjective, but I've tried to use a standardized framework when it comes to assessing characters. I've given them a score based on the 3 core areas of gameplay: Raid, War, and Horde mode, a term that I've coined to describe a character's performance in wave-based modes like survival and legendary release events. The other thing that I look for with these characters is synergy. How well do they work within their faction and with others? From a game design perspective, I think that Snowprint have a different approach and don't necessarily try and mesh factions together all the time. I've left the Black Legion characters out of consideration for this video. Since they've been promised a rework, they'll get benefit of the doubt for now. As a thank you to you for your support, please enjoy this code as well. On screen here is an infographic of the 12 I have decided to list. I'm sure there are some of you that have managed to do well with some of these characters, but bear with me as I break down and validate each choice. There are a couple of characters tied for bottom spot, but I will start with the Deathleaper. The Deathleaper's stats are fairly average, but the problem I have is with its active ability. This ability is unusable on turn 1 because the Lictor starts in Deep Strike, so the soonest you can send the Deathleaper on the prowl is on turn 2, and that means the active only comes into action on turn 3 onwards. Generally speaking, the ability is just a turn too slow to impact the battlefield. While you can engineer scenarios where it works, I just don't feel like the character plays well and doesn't have much synergy with the rest of the Tyranid faction. The simple fix here would be to simply remove Deep Strike from the Lictor or allow the active to be usable on turn 1. I would probably also buff its defensive stats slightly and maybe give it Rapid Assault to really make it feel like something fast moving in the shadows waiting to strike at you. The Deathleaper is so close to being good enough, but I think the problem stems from his active ability. The passive is actually pretty cool. Constantly charging down enemies results in suppressing them and healing the Deathleaper himself. It gives you this cool hunter-like feel which fits the Lictor aesthetic. The Dark Angels really got a rotten deal in this game. Forecast is excellent, but the rest are really quite niche characters that don't blend as well as the other newer factions do. Comparing the synergy between the Genestealer cults and the Dark Angels can be like comparing chalk and cheese. It's a real shame because Azrael is their leader and chapter master. Not only is he not even a legendary character, but his kit doesn't bring together the team particularly well. His stats are fine, but he's generally just a very underwhelming character. Normally, I like to suggest small fixes or tweaks to a character, but in Azrael's case, I wonder if he just needs to be reworked completely. Tied with the same score is Sybil. Anyone who has played Sybil knows just how fragile she is, and her defensive stats reflect that. The problem with Sybil isn't actually so much her kit. I think it's actually reasonable and unique. Providing a sort of stealth or infiltrate type effect to your team is great and gives her a niche against Overwatch style teams. In fact, I've used her to good effect with the Orcs, where Golgorth uses his Wag under her protection and slaughters enemies. I think that she just needs some number tweaks, to her health primarily, but probably also to her abilities. Next up is Darkstrider, which really saddens me to say. Once upon a time, Darkstrider was one of the cornerstones of a ranged raid team, but that was well over 2 years ago, and the ravages of time have not been kind to him nor his kit. Darkstrider is defensively fragile, with an active ability that is meant to disrupt enemies and enable his Tau allies to do damage. The problem is just how difficult it is to consistently get benefits from his kit, requiring intricate positioning and usually an all-Tau team. If you use him in such a fashion and combine him with a broadside, you might get some benefit in a mode like War with a small burst of damage. He is probably a character that is close but not quite there numbers-wise. I really like the idea of a ranged damage buffer, something that might enable a ranged multi-hit team to at least enter the conversation with characters like Ragnar, Karn, Dante, and Carrion. For personal reasons, I really hope that Snowprint look at Darkstrider and give him a buff. Even if it's just a case of improving the numbers on his passive, this would at least allow more theory crafting and potentially ranged team compositions. In the next tier down, we have Macer. I was really excited about this guy when he came out. He hits hard and does a lot of damage, but when you assess him by the metrics that make a character useful, he sadly falls short. Macer has a paltry armor stat, and similar to Sybil, he feels very fragile when you control him. The trade-off is that his kit rewards you when you take damage. Specifically, in the right settings, Macer can deal huge amounts of damage and kill multiple characters in a single turn. The difficulty is the amount of work required to get there. He is so fragile that he isn't useful in survival modes, and his kit isn't suited to raids. So really, you are going all in on a character that is only situationally useful in war, and even then quite fragile and likely to die after attacking. I liked him a bit more before the Warhowl nerf, but now I generally avoid this guy. I suppose Macer's ranking here is also a symptom of this ranking system looking at war as the PvP mode. Macer is pretty threatening in modes like Tournament Arena, where a big burst of damage, even if the character dies, is quite useful. Cut is an interesting one because from a stat perspective he's an absolute monster. He has a good damage stat, albeit with physical damage. What then makes him so bad? I think that it's just the numbers on his abilities that need some help. He throws a grenade with his active, which is fine, if not particularly exciting. His passive gives a small amount of bonus damage when charging, and I truly do mean small when you compare it with some of the other damage buffs flying around the game now. Cut essentially suffers from being one of the earliest characters in the game, and therefore a victim to power creep and number creep that is inevitable in gaming. We have other characters that get bonus damage and other effects while charging, with Ragnar and Deathleaper being easy examples. Perhaps Cut could get something along those lines too. Thaumaches sticks out like a bit of a sore thumb. His faction is great and the Thousand Suns generally work really well with one another. His active ability to take over a group of summons is cool in theory, but rarely ever works out well and generally is only a move for war. Thaumaches' kit doesn't really have any utility for raids, and he doesn't do enough to make it onto the Psyker team either. Much like the earlier comment from Macer, Thaumaches might actually be better suited to Tournament Arena, but that's a metric we're not assessing here. His shield is a nice little bit of sustain, but the trouble with shields is that the protection they confer isn't affected by armor. As a result, enemies burn through your shield very quickly, and Thaumaches doesn't have the stats to stay standing after that. Rather than have his active capped at a percentage damage, I'd love it if the active granted the summons bonus damage instead, which might make them a bit stronger. It would be even cooler if Thaumaches permanently gained control of the summons instead, but that might be too complex to code or too powerful altogether. Niall was on the Feeble Five, and without a rework it's not surprising to see him here again. The active ability is certainly cool and unique. It is one of the few in the game that can apply a hex effect to multiple hexes at once. Stunning flying units is flavoursome, as you imagine the Space Wolf librarian calling down a blizzard that affects those in the sky most. The problem with Niall is just how heavily he relies on the ice hex effect to be effective. This hex effect only lasts for 2 rounds, and there simply aren't many ways in the game to consistently and effectively generate this hex effect. Of his fellow Space Wolves, Ulf can make some ice reliably, and Arjak also has the chance to make some ice. Additionally, despite having Terminator armor, he doesn't have the ability to deep strike, so he is hindered by his movement speed of 2. How would I fix him? I think that he needs to have a more reliable way of gaining damage, or at least dealing consistent damage. Could it be that every time he attacks an enemy on ice, the damage he gains is permanent? If Snowprint are worried about making this too strong, you could cap this bonus damage at a certain amount. Giving him Deep Strike would also give him a lot of extra usability, especially as the ice hex effect would then hinder enemy movement. Varro is a core campaign character, so will always have some basic value, but the sooner you learn that the Indomitus campaign is carried by Bellator, the better. He's a fairly average psyker with a fairly average active ability. I don't think the passive can be relied upon for consistent damage, and I really dislike characters who rely heavily on RNG mechanics in general. He has no internal synergy with the Ultramarines, who as a faction lack synergy anyway. I'm including him here as a lesson to newer players that might watch this video. Just because he is your first character doesn't mean he's good. I think that the passive probably needs a rework, and ideally the Ultramarines get some faction trait that makes them stronger and more cohesive. Thutmose is a glass cannon. He does a lot of damage, especially with his active and passive abilities, but is incredibly fragile. The Necrons generally are fairly defensively fragile, and I think that their stats have been power crept as more characters have been introduced to the game. In order to use Thutmose effectively, you need him to be in melee or close to enemies, which simply exposes him too much and causes him to die. How could we fix him? Well, we could learn further into his glass cannon sort of build and increase his damage numbers slightly, but I think I prefer making him more survivable. It just seems a little odd that he wants so desperately to be close to the enemy to attack, but will fold to a stiff breeze. Jane Czar used to be much better, especially when her active ability could benefit from Ragnar's Warhowl. For me, she once had a position in that team as a melee infiltrator that could negate Overwatch and kill 4 units at once. Now that her active can't be buffed in the same way, she is exposed as quite a fragile character who doesn't even really have the offensive output to make it all worthwhile. Her passive is a pseudo-terrifying trait, but obviously requires investment to be useful. She doesn't quite fit into any raid teams and is too fragile for a longer wave-based mode like survival. You can engineer some niche situations where you crowd the spawn point and apply her damage reduction to enemies, but generally she needs a lot of help. I would start by giving her the terrifying trait on top of her passive to really feed into her damage reduction and probably give her more hits and damage. Howling Banshees are supposed to be fragile, but I think that she can gain more offensively with this balance. Finally, the character I have listed as the worst in the game is Certus. I have given him 1s across the board because honestly he's pretty rubbish. Although Certus is a campaign character, the campaign can be carried by Bellator or other characters with summons. He has a reasonable damage stat but suffers from being super fragile defensively. That sort of makes sense for a sniper type character, but his passive is just bulky and too conditional. I had to read the ability about 3 times before I really understood what it meant and how it applies. How would I fix him? To start with, I'd bring his stats more in line with other ranged characters, and I think that his passive needs to be completely reworked. I would start by giving him a static damage reduction from ranged attacks and see if I could make the passive more interesting after that. I think you could also improve his damage type to piercing for a bit of extra oomph. It's also a bit odd that the Eliminator NPC, who looks and feels very similar to Certus, has a movement speed of 3. I would buff Certus to the same level. There you go, the Dismal Dozen. Do you agree or disagree? I want to reiterate that I recognize Snowprint have a lot of competing things that require developer time, so I understand that character reworks have been a little bit on the back burner. I just want this video to be something fun and hopefully help us guide them towards characters that need looked at the most. That's all I've got. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and bye for now.